Hi, I'm Michelle Shingler, the editor-in-chief of Foreword Reviews, and you're tuning into Petit Forward, our bite-sized interviews with indie authors. Today, we're speaking with Sarah Hall, whose new book, Sown in the Stars, released in early April. It uses interviews with knowledgeable Appalachians to survey the revered practice of planting, farming, and harvesting by the phases of the moon and the positions of the zodiac, noting that when a practice continues for a long period of time, there just might be something to it. Sarah, thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So for those who are uninitiated, what does it mean to plant by the signs, and why has interest in it seen such a resurgence in recent years?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of two answers to that question. One is on a very practical level. It means that if somebody plants by the signs, then they typically have a calendar or an almanac that they have adopted and choose to go by in order to sort of guide their gardening activities. So that's kind of on a practical level what it means. The sort of deeper question is, okay, well, what is that based on? What are the recommendations, what are they based on? And that gets a little bit deeper into sort of astronomy and astrology and how the two are connected, but not exactly the same. And so with that part, most people are familiar with what we would call their sun sign. So that is, the month. Essentially, you have the 12 constellations of the zodiac, and so we have about a month during the 1 year revolution of the earth around the sun, you have about a month where each of those constellations is going to be on the other side of the sun from the perspective of the earth, essentially. So that's your sun sign, is dependent on where the placement of things were when you were born. The moon sign is sort of zooming in on that, thinking about the approximately 28 to 29 day rotation of the moon around the earth. And so each of those 12 zodiac signs would have a 2 to 2.5 day window when a constellation would be on the other side of the moon from the perspective of the earth. And so within 1 month, again, you've got about 2 to 2.5 days in each of those 12 signs that it cycles through. And certain ones are said to be good signs in which you would want to plant, and others are not good signs. They're often referred to as killing signs, and those would be the ones that you would want to do things like garden or kill pests or things like that.
Thank you. That was so much information packed in. Thank you. So you point out that it's often women who are responsible for handing down astrological planting knowledge. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And on the one hand, sort of, globally and historically, women have played really important roles in farming, sort of, across time. But I think in particular, because I was interviewing people in Kentucky and in Appalachia, I think part of that is just that essentially since the Industrial Revolution, oftentimes the men would be the ones that would work in the coal mines or, work in a factory during the day. And women were often responsible for a lot of the gardening, as well as small children who were too young to work, right? So it is really interesting. That was something that I was a little bit surprised by when I did the interviews, was learning that, I did interview a number of men who do it, but for the most part, they had learned from women in their lives. And that was a bit of a surprise for me.
So you also point out that the tie-ins to the patterns of the stars, planting by the signs, has a little bit of a contentious relationship to Christianity. So how do people who farm this way in Appalachia, which is also very rooted in Christian tradition, reconcile those tensions?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I wouldn't necessarily say that they sort of have a contentious relationship, but certainly Christianity sort of replaced some of the functions of astrology, right? So sort of trying to find patterns and reasoning for how things happen. And a number of people that I interviewed actually cited Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 to 2, and it's written on the back of the book as sort of evidence of the fact that, planting by the signs does fit with Christianity. And even there's, sort of the fact that that's a place in the Bible that refers to it. So that's of course the verse that some of people are either familiar with due to the birds turn 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 song,
Yeah.
or from the Bible that says there's a time and a season for everything under the heavens, including planting and reaping and all that kind of stuff. So yeah. One other response to that, actually, I wanted to read just a really brief excerpt from this is Debbie Cook of Letcher County. And so for about a decade, Debbie gardened alongside her mother-in-law, Josephine Spangler Cook. Josephine's instructions were clear: plant in the breast or neck and never plant in the bowels or feet. Peas should be planted on Valentine's Day. Harvesting must be done in the morning while it is still damp, and planting is typically done in the evening. Josephine considered the use of a farmer's almanac, which tells readers when to do things, a form of cheating. Instead, she used a calendar from the local garden supply store. Debbie still uses a similar one put out by the Letcher County Soil Conservation District. Debbie's Pennsylvania Dutch and Swiss Mennonite ancestors brought 2 books with them, an almanac and a Bible. Quote, this was her quote, "And that kind of floored me to think that 300 years ago they were studying the stars and planting stuff. I feel like it's kind of part of my heritage because I'm a little bit more than half German. And I know that to my ancestors that was important. So it becomes important to me." That's the end of that.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So your interviews all evince immense respect for your subjects, some of whom are repositories of this very esoteric knowledge that's kind of endangered. And you also record their expressions of respect for those that they learn from. What's at risk if we don't tell stories like these, if we don't keep recording them and passing them down?
Yeah, so I mean, to me, it's just cultural heritage, right? It's an understanding of how things have happened in the past when humans were very necessarily more connected to the earth, right? We had to get our sustenance, we had to make a living from it. And so it seems very natural to me that when that is your daily existence, you're going to pay attention to things like the stars and the placement, the phase of the moon and all those sorts of things. And that is very different from the lives most of us lead today, right? And so I think it's just important to document that and to have that history, especially for people who don't necessarily have a connection to it in their daily lives.
Yeah, for sure. So what are your best first suggestions for those who might be interested in astrological planning at home?
Yeah, so I have a couple. The first one, if you're interested in kind of understanding, especially the real basics of kind of what are the calendars and recommendations based on, obviously check out the book. So that's the first one. And I do go into a lot of detail sort of historically, how things have come about, but from a you don't have to be an astronomer to understand it, because I am not. So hopefully it's fairly approachable. Certainly if you have any family or friends that do a lot of gardening, I would encourage you to talk to them, to have conversations, ask them if they have heard of this, of planting by the signs, or if they know anybody who has. I think that's a really important message, is just that we have a lot of knowledge in people who are still doing it now, or in some cases people will say, oh, my grandfather did, but I never really paid attention, or I know he had the calendar, or that sort of thing. But just finding out if you have resources around you, I think is a really good thing to do too. And then basically you pick a calendar or an almanac and start taking records and trying to pay a little bit of attention. And it's worth noting that it can be a little bit hard to strictly follow it and follow guidelines if you are a hobby a hobby gardener, right? You have a full-time job and you're doing things just when you can, essentially, and when the weather cooperates. But as a start, you can just simply get a calendar and write down when it is that you plant things, how much, if the harvest goes well or not, or, if you lost things. That's a really basic level to start at. And it was something when I was doing the interviews, many people pulled out their calendars when I met with them from previous years where they had kept their records of things. And so sometimes, the sort of anecdotal stories or evidence that they would give for, hitting something at the right sign would be held. The records were in those calendars, they were able to pull them out. And so that's the other just sort of very practical advice. If folks are on Facebook, there is a Facebook page called Planting by the Signs that is actually run by one of the people that I interviewed, who's in Frankfort, Kentucky. Phil Case runs it, and he gives out a weekly kind of overview, puts those out and just has the dates and when different signs are, and also what that means in terms of what you would want to do on those different days. So that's also a really good beginner's way. And even if you're not quite implementing it, you can start to sort of learn and get a feel for it just by looking at that and paying a little bit of attention.
Thank you so much. So to our audience, Sown on the Stars is on shelves now. Be sure to pick up your copy. Your garden will definitely thank you for it. It's full of such great information. And we really appreciate you talking with us, Sarah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Michelle.